Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course. I wanted to make a brief video introducing myself, Dan Toohey, your teacher for Philosophy of Death in the fall of 2020 at St. Joe's. Briefly introduce myself and more importantly, to introduce you to the basic themes and readings of our course. My name is Daniel Toohey, and I have been teaching as a part-time instructor in the philosophy department at St. Joseph's for many years. More than 23 years. I like St. Joe's. I like Jesuits. I'm not a Jesuit, but I like Jesuits. So I very much enjoy teaching here. And I've taught here for many years, and I've taught this course, Philosophy of Death, for many years, which is both a plus and a minus. I've also been teaching online for many years, for about 11 years, which is also a plus and a minus. That is, if you teach a course for a long time, you kind of convince yourself that you know something about the subject, which is probably wrong. So you got to keep me honest and don't let me get too sure of myself or pompous about things. And if you teach online for a long time too, you think you know how to do that too, and that doesn't really that's not really true, or not necessarily true. So if I'm messing up, let me know. Email me or call me, or otherwise let me know the mistakes that I've made, and I will not be offended, and I will simply correct them. But that's me, Dan Toohey. You can contact me through email or call me on my cell phone whenever you want to talk about the class or anything. Okay. So this course is Philosophy of Death, and the first thing I want you to be clear on is this is not a clinical course. This is not a course that is a medical ethics course or in some way or another meant to be an empirically based course on end-of-life issues like hospice care and grieving families and clinical definitions of death, things like that. It's not like that at all. It's a philosophy course. It's a basic philosophy course, or it's a philosophy course that deals with fundamental basic issues involving death. So this is not a medical ethics or applied ethics course. This is a theoretically based philosophical investigation into the nature of death and some associated issues. That should become clear from the brief outline that I've given you. The course is in 5 parts. And hopefully there's a certain logic to the course. I think the course does fit together in a certain way once you're familiar with all the materials. I think you'll see those connections. Part 1, Epicureanism and its puzzles. Really, we start with this wonderful brief reading by ancient philosopher Epicurus, his letter to his friend Menoicus, in which he defines death in a certain way. And his definition of death implies a certain attitude towards death, a certain ethical attitude, or a certain practical attitude towards death. Basically, that death should be nothing to us because we become nothing at death. We'll go into all of this in much more detail in the individual modules, but I just want to give you an overview. Part 1 really starts with the Epicurean Thesis about death, and then we read 2 things that disagree with Epicurus, at least one very important part of the Epicurean theory, and that is his conclusion that death cannot be considered a bad thing for the person who dies. Both Thomas Nagel and, in week 3, Bruckner and Fisher's Why is Death Bad? Both attempt to refute that conclusion. It may seem funny to say it now, and it is, but they try to prove that at least sometimes death is a bad thing for the person who dies. Believe me, it makes plenty of sense when you read it. In part 2 of the course, we open up quite a bit. We go from the first few weeks really being about a very narrow issue involving certain logic of death, the question of whether it can be bad for somebody. We open up into the issue of mortality, which is different. Well, one of the things that you'll see in this course is that there's a big distinction between death and mortality. The meaning of death, at least under the Epicurean stricture of death being nothing, is death is meaningless. because it's not something we'll actually ever go through. Jonas and Gray are interested not in death so much as mortality, and mortality is the condition of being that you and I are in right now. That is, we are the kind of creatures that can die at any moment, and sometime in the future certainly will die. What is the meaning of that? That is not of death itself, but meaning of being the kind of creature that knows that someday it will die. And both of those essays have to do with that in a certain respect. Part 3 of the course really changes direction, because in parts 1 and 2 of the course, in looking at these philosophical issues involving death, where more or less all of the authors that we deal with will be taking Epicurus' position that the human being becomes nothing at death, that the human being is completely annihilated, that there's no such thing as any experience or life after death. It's not until week 6 of the course, when we begin to read Plato's Phaedo, that we look at alternatives to that. Both Plato, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, is a rough contemporary of Epicurus, and the 20th century Catholic philosopher Paul Landsberg both argue that death is not the absolute permanent end of the human being, of the human person, but that there are reasons to believe that our existence transcends the limits of the body, and that there is some aspect of the human person which is immortal and infinite. Now, there are very different ways of approaching it, and that's a big part of this section of the course, is to see how Plato and Landsberg both believe in something like a life after death, but for very different reasons, and have a very different conception of what that state of being after death is. Part 4 of the course, After Immortality, the Book of Life. I call it After Immortality because Hartshorne and again Hans Jonas give us 20th century views of the possibility of immortality, which are much more moderate, much more scaled down from the kind of really extravagant, radical ideas of Plato and Landsberg, who believe in a full-fledged life after death. What we get in Hartshorne and Jonas and their common idea of the Book of Life is a notion of that there is something about the human person that does survive death, but it's not the full-blown experiential life that is traditionally argued for in earlier thinkers like Plato. Finally, part 5 of the course, The Dead, deals with the status of the dead and also the experience of grief. These 3 readings are, I could say, loosely connected, but are connected because they, in one way or another, deal with the departed. They deal with the dead. Donald Gustafson's Grief is an attempt to give a definition of what it means to be grieving, what grief actually is as a specific emotion. C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed consists of Lewis's journals that he kept in the immediate aftermath of his wife's death, and are extremely personal to him, but you'll see that there are some very interesting connections between some of the things that he says and Gustafson. And finally, Walter Schultz's The Problem of Death, which has to do with, well, really not only these 2 readings, but I think everything in the course is a good way to end the course, because it's a very, I would say, contemporary idea from one particular point of view about the way that modern people actually view the meaning of the phenomenon of death. So that is a very brief overview of the course, just to give you some sense of what we will be reading and what sort of topics we will be exploring in this course. And if nothing else, I think I've told you what the course isn't about, which is probably more important, that you should have some notion of what you're actually going to be doing and reading in this course.